Yeah, gotta aim for the top like, hold up. Yeah, I can never doubt myself, I know better. All of you critics be acting like you know better. Blowing the smoke, but I know when the dust settles that I'm in my element. It's evident that there's levels to the game.
So what's happening, people? Welcome back to the Athletes to Athletes podcast. Good to have you back with us. I am the host, as always, Ryan Holmes, and always joined by my man, Reed Meyer, co-founder of Athletes to Athletes. And we're going to dig into some more topics today. And before we do, I am going to have like a little caveat of this because we're going to discuss the DOJ and all political feelings, thoughts, notions aside. Like there is nothing that will be added to this conversation because of it being the Biden DOJ and now we're under the Trump DOJ. So all politics aside when it comes to this conversation, but the DOJ and the former Department of Education will be discussed during this conversation. So figured I'd have that caveat before we dig into it, as you know, this isn't a political conversation. It is just what happened under certain political affiliations. With that, we are going to discuss how in the final days of the Biden administration, how they stepped in with the House versus NCAA case. And to kind of set the stage, I'm going to read from an article that Reed and I have been kind of going back and forth on and reading from for reference. And the article is titled, before we even get into it, give it proper credence and reference. It's on SI.com and it's titled Biden Administration Challenges Trump on NCAA Settlement and Title IX. So going to be kind of digging into what is said in this article. We'll also put all of the reference materials that we're discussing in the summary so you guys can go back and read all of these as well. But to kind of set the stage, this is what took place and what our conversation will be around today. And the paragraph I'm going to read starts and it says, in a last-ditch effort before surrendering power, the Biden-led Department of Education and Department of Justice have released memos attempting to significantly change the regulatory landscape of college athletics. The Education Department released a fact sheet. The fact sheet is linked here for you to look at, indicating that future revenue sharing payments to athletes will be subject to Title IX scrutiny. And the DOJ has stated in the letter of interest, the letter is also hyperlinked for you to look at, that the anticipated 22% revenue sharing cap that appears likely to be implemented next academic year violates antitrust law. For me, when I read that, my ears perked up because the entire case is an antitrust case. So with the DOJ and the Department of Education stepping in and saying, even though you are literally litigating an antitrust case, your settlement can violate antitrust law even further. Um, and you know, for the Department of Justice as well as the Department of Education to step in, kind of in the 11th hour, right? This article was published on January 18th, 2 days before the inauguration. For them to step in and for to have this last ditch effort, it's surprising but unsurprising because the Biden administration's Department of Justice has stepped in on other cases as well on athletics, not as widely and highly publicized as this one, certainly, but they have stepped in. So anybody that has been paying attention to what goes on in college athletics, you've probably seen them step in on other cases, which is also referenced in this article, which you'll read about, or at least you can read about once you listen to our takes and things like that. But the interesting part for me, outside of them saying that it can violate antitrust laws, of their decision can violate further antitrust laws, is a lot of schools are already moving to implement this in the next year. You're already seeing a lot of schools talk about delineating money to different athletic departments and making sure that they have enough money to cover. Some even going as far as possibly cutting sports to offset the cost. and cost offset will be something that we speak about in a part two of this episode. Um, but that was the interesting part for me is a lot of the wheels are kind of already in motion, and the final decision comes with a hearing on the settlement that's scheduled for April 7th. So with that, there's a lot that needs to happen now, right? Because the DOJ is stepping in and they are saying that there could be some other violations and that they are trying to stop the 22% rev sharing cap, right? And it's them kind of saying you need to kind of pump the brakes because even though this will act as a collective bargaining agreement, it still isn't really truly collective bargaining, right? And Reed, this is a topic that you wanted to discuss, and I'm sure you have a lot more to say than I do. So I'm going to kind of step aside and allow you to kind of jump in and give your take on when you read about this topic and saw that the DOJ had stepped in on a topic that we've discussed a number of times on this show. And we probably were thinking that we would be talking about a signed, sealed, delivered settlement by now. We're not, and it's the Department of Education and as well as the former DOJ that is stepping in and is halting a lot of these things. So what are your thoughts on the things that are now happening with this very long and drawn out case?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, right? I think both departments have really compelling arguments for what they're talking about. And I think we all kind of there was conversations and questions of like, well, that doesn't really make sense, but I guess they're gonna go through with it and they're just seeing what the new thing is.
Hmm.
And on both sides, when they kind of laid it out, it was like, oh yeah, that doesn't make any sense. Like we've repackaged this thing, but it's not necessarily any different. For example, the Department of Education, right? When they came out with their Title IX statement, we all kind of figured that was maybe going to come into play, but they did a pretty good job of laying it out in the sense of like we haven't really changed. Yes, we're doing direct athlete compensation or direct revenue streams through schools, but really, we've just repackaged the scholarship program. Yeah, we've changed how they're delivered. Yeah, we've changed equivalency sports and headcount sports and different things like that. But at the end of the day, it is schools providing financial aid to athletes to come play at that school. That is what it is. So to ever assume or think that Title IX wasn't going to apply to the same thing it's been applying to for decades, when you read it like that, it's like, oh yeah, that's ridiculous that is how that's going to work. And I think obviously it's important for the Department of Education to put that memo out and to let people know that should still be respected in that process. I think part of it too was you started to get inklings of what those department or what those college budgets were going to look like. And from a college perspective, it's hard to blame them for how they structured that athlete revenue, right? Texas Tech is a perfect example. I think it was athletic director that posted some proposed budgets for some of them, and you looked at how Texas Tech structured their proposed direct compensation budget, and it was almost in line with the revenue budget, right? Football was about 70 to 75% of the revenue in the athletics department. It was about 70 to 75% of the revenue on the athletic compensation department. So from a business perspective, I completely understand how and why they separated the things the way that they did. I mean, they're looking at enrollments, they're looking at trends, they're looking at money, and they're trying to match those things up. The problem is you're not a business, you're a school. And unfortunately, I mean, talk to whoever you want to talk to. Those two things are now combined in the American system. If you are a college, you are a business, you know, and vice versa in a lot of situations. But you can't put out a budget under, knowing that you have always been under Title IX that spends, 3,607% more money on football than any other women's sport in your budget. Like you
Hmm.
have to know that that isn't going to fly given the previous rules that you've had to play under for the whole time. So I get 100% how schools have got to that budget. I get 100% Title IX coming in and saying, whoa, 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 this is the same thing we've always had. You can't just completely change the game on that. So that's going to require some really aggressive finagling. And really, the winners of this, I would argue, would be women's sports. I mean, they're going to have theoretically far more funding available to them to compete. And as we've seen with anything, if you give something money, if you give something fodder, if it's going to do well, it's going to do well. I mean, there's a reason why Nebraska volleyball had 3,000 people show up for a volleyball game, right? Like
That's
it's
for
not as
sure.
if women's sport isn't appealing. It's that sometimes you just aren't given the resources. And
Hmm.
based on the budget that you saw from from Texas Tech, like there was no intent to give resources in that space. So it's going to be kind of fun to see, in my opinion, let's give this some fodder, give it some flame, and see how this stuff grows. So I'm hopeful that that does end up coming through and is implemented across the programs. I know from like a budgetary standpoint, some schools might not be excited about it, but at the end of the day, like you're a school. Your job is to provide equitable resources for people. That's college sports, that's college education, that's college everything. Now we could have a greater conversation about the overall equity of higher education in the US, but that's not what this podcast is about. So
Hmm.
from the Department of Education side, I think that to me is really intriguing. And then you nailed it on the Department of Justice side. Like effectively what the NCAA and what Congress tried to do was create a collective bargaining agreement by leaving out one of the main parties of the collective bargaining agreement.
Exactly.
There wasn't a student athlete in sight that had an opinion on how this thing was going to be structured. So the numbers are made up from these two groups, the timelines are made up between these two groups, all the additional sort of considerations are made up among these independent groups. So, like, is it really a collective bargaining agreement? Could you possibly call it that? And if you're going to try to label it under that world, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't build the framework for the collective bargaining agreement and then gift it to one half of the side of the collective bargaining agreement. That's famously not how that works and why
Yeah.
collective bargaining agreements exist in the first place. So, if that is what your intent is or what you were trying to market this as, immediately just based on the definition, you have not done what you need to do in that space. And so I can understand, I mean, the DOJ from the way they saw it and the way the memo came out was like, you set your own rules, you gave yourself a 10-year buffer on this agreement, and now you're just going to send it off into the universe and try to take some autonomy back as the NCAA on sort of how this stuff is managed and covered. So again, we've effectively repackaged what we already had. There's a couple different pieces in there, funnel it back out, hope nobody cares for a decade is
Yeah.
effectively kind of what you're seeing when the memo sort of lays it out that way. So I, yeah, I mean it's we've been under multiple years of going back and forth on this stuff, and there's this progress and we're growing and we know we need to provide compensation and it has to change, and it's all the same stuff. Like we're repackaging the same stuff when you look at how this stuff is set up. And, there was a memo sent out by the International Tennis Association as well. I think it was maybe yesterday or the day before, which is cool because you're seeing after the Department of Education and the Department of Justice have come out and said, hey, this is what the heck? You've had additional smaller organizations kind of have, I would argue, sort of the moxie and the courage now to say, like, yeah, that is kind of messed up. Like now that I'm looking at
Hmm.
this. And you look at him and he's like, man, when I look at the numbers and I look at the distribution, like without any protections that were put in place, with the NCAA, with Title IX, with these things, I'm just going to watch my sport erode away. Like tennis is just going to
Yeah.
become a club sport. All this funding, we talk about all this funding, all this compensation for athletes. Okay, football, men's basketball, Juju Watkins specifically, like not,
Yeah.
not even just her essentially. Like that's what they're talking about when they talk about the breakdown. And so he's sitting there on the side going like, we have an opportunity to bring in some of the best amateur tennis players in the world and give them an opportunity to get education and condense all this amazing talent into this organization. But it's going to become a club sport. How do we get international kids to come and do that? How do we get out-of-state kids to go and condense into certain places? Like I get his frustration as well. Like you're just watching other people make decisions for your sport. And for so many of the programs outside of, the revenue generating models, they're probably sitting there going like, this was okay. Like we had our system, we were good, we're under the college blanket, like we're providing education for folks. Why do we have to be involved in all this crap, essentially? I think is kind
Yeah.
of the growing sentiment. It's like, why didn't you revenue generating people just go in the corner and figure out what you needed to figure out? Because you're kind of who caused this issue. And then for the rest of us, like, don't blow our entire system up. Yeah, there needs to be change. Yeah, there needs to be reform. Yeah, there needs to be conversations. But like, why are you trying to make a blanket adjustment on this process for 2 to 3 sports that are truly causing the riff in the situation? And so that's been really interesting to kind of watched develop over the last couple of weeks, specifically.
Yeah, and there's a couple different things I want to speak to that you mentioned, and the first is the collective bargaining, and you said it. I mean, you nailed it. They this would serve as a collective bargaining agreement. However, in any other collective bargaining agreement, call it NBA, call it NFLPA, there's a players association that is in the room for that. There is no NCAA PA. There is no players association that was in the room or that even really truly exists, right? Like there's a few athlete groups and things like that, but there isn't a true organization that is part of the CBAs like the NFLPA, like the NBAPA, right? Like they all have players in the room that discuss these things and they put contracts in place. And when those contracts are void or whatever else, there's strikes and they're no longer playing, right? And there's a holdup until there's a new collective bargaining agreement, or at least not, maybe not a new collective bargaining agreement in place, but there's a conversation about those things. And they say, okay, we will continue to operate under this set of standards until we renegotiate everything, right? So that was the first thing that kind of perked up when you said that. I think you nailed it with that. The other is the antitrust part of it. And I know I said the antitrust, that violating antitrust was the thing that I noticed in the paragraph that I read when we started the show. But the other piece of it that isn't part of this, which is something that we spoke about a long time ago, is within this settlement, which would serve as a CBA, is that the athletes can never bring this sort of antitrust case ever again, which is the thing that a lot of people are forgetting is when the settlement happens, it's literally said by the NCAA, okay, we will settle this, but when it's settled once, it's settled forever. You can no longer bring about an antitrust case, which is one of the things that is part of this. So, with them repackaging essentially what they're doing and then saying, okay, here's the CBA in quotes, here's the new scholarship rules, here's the new scholarship caps, here's the new this, the new that. You're right. They're effectively repackaging it. And the DOJ was really just like, wait, all of this just involved you guys, but now to offset all of those things, you're bringing in everyone else. So everybody else now has to write checks that you never wrote in the first place. And that is the issue. And that's why you have the different corporations, or at least the different sports, that are now stepping up and saying, hold on, wait a second. You're in effect kind of fleecing the rest of us in order to get what you guys need. Um, the third thing is Texas A&M. Texas A&M has been used by myself. I've certainly used Texas A&M a number of times during these conversations as an example because they were kind of first in a lot of these things. Their budget was out. We're able to look at their line items, and from a business standpoint, their budget makes sense. Football is generating this amount of money. Okay, we're going to replenish the amount of money that they're bringing in, kind of just making it cyclical, right? Like they're just going to make it a complete circle and say they bring in this much, we put out this much, so that it's just a never ending circle. However, it is, as you said, it is not the NFL that works in and of itself. Probably better, it's not the NBA, which works in and of itself, but has the WNBA that it subsidizes to the point where the NBA players make significantly more than the WNBA players, right? So you're not going to be able to do something with football that you can't do with women's gymnastics when it comes to college sports, because they are not independent businesses like our professional leagues are, where they can say the NBA brings in this amount of money, therefore we can, put in our budget that the NBA gets this amount of money and we will subsidize the women's league with the leftover cash, essentially. And I say that in quotes because it's a line item. So they're like, okay, what's left? What's left goes here, right? Um, but the reason I say Texas A&M has been used kind of as a guinea pig is because when all of these things were happening initially, yeah, Texas Tech, you're right. When all of these things were happening initially, they they were the schools that everyone looked to because they were getting rid of the people in the athletic departments. They were the ones that they were being looked to where they were like, okay, well, if all of this is going to happen, we have to start clearing out some of the people to offset this cost. And I know, and it was the Texas schools that were doing it first and foremost, where it was the Texas Techs, it was the Texas A&Ms. The Texas A&M was one of the ones that kind of lit up for me, where they had kind of a mass exodus of the people in their athletic department because they knew they were going to need the extra cash on hand. So like the Texas schools are kind of out in front of a lot of these things, and as we saw, I mean, UT certainly out in front of things with NIL, with having the things that they've had. So it's going to be very interesting as things start to progress. And another piece of the article that I want to read that kind of also furthers the point from the DOJ is it says that the DOJ wanted to have its voice be heard on collegiate revenue sharing, emphasizing that even though athletes will be paid, restricting the free market for their athletic services without collectively bargaining salary cap puts them in significant antitrust enforcement danger. So that drives home even more of why the DOJ stepped in, because they had probably seen, okay, they're already violating antitrust, one, which is why this case came about in the first place. Within this lawsuit, within this settlement, antitrust cannot be brought back up against the NCAA. However, within their settlement, they are violating this. So maybe we don't want to have things be relitigated once again, which, let's call it what it is, probably inevitable that it's going to happen again, because as we're seeing now, things are drastically changing. They're going to continue to drastically change. Um, they're stepping in and saying, we don't want to have another antitrust case where it is the athletes versus the NCAA once again. So you probably should, you've got a lot more I's to dot and T's to cross before we get to the end of this.
Yeah, and it's no wonder everyone was a little bit curious, I think, whenever Charlie Baker got hired as the NCAA president and like politician, man. Like he knows I think the only one smart thing I've seen them do in the last 5 to 6 years is realize that the house was about to get brought down on them and start to plan accordingly in that space, right? You know how to manage these types of situations. You know how to sort of work this through the courts or Congress or local or whatever it might be. I think that, to the NCAA's credit, like they've hired somebody who knows how to navigate that really effectively. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
until this was all kind of put in front of people's faces, it they were doing a pretty damn good job
Yeah.
of kind of still getting what they want out of this outcome with the least amount of blood possible. I think what the part that continues to sort of sit in my head on this stuff is that it feels like they're trying to cherry pick. And when I say they, it's kind of the royal. I think the NCAA is guilty of this. I think, to an extent, the schools are guilty of this. I think players inevitably become guilty of this just by nature of everyone sort of running to their own respective corner, which feels like a metaphor for all things
Mm-hmm.
nationally right now. Um, is the idea that they want their cake and they want to eat it too, right? They like the appeal of they want to give up certain aspects of amateurism that they want to hold on to so much, but they want to keep certain aspects of it. And at a certain point, you just have to admit that like these two things don't gel. So we need to make a decision. Like there needs to be some hard cuts. Either we need to sort of take away this idea of amateurism and understand that college sports is, a new thing, it has an economy behind it. We've built an economy around it. We need to be compensated accordingly. There needs to be employment status put in there. Maybe that applies to all the schools. Maybe that applies, or sorry, all the sports. Maybe that applies to certain sports once they reach certain revenue numbers, right? So maybe you have that conversation with basketball, men's basketball. Maybe you have that conversation with Division I football, and you let the other pieces stay what they are as amateur. And I think that they want to create the NCAA in this case, I think, wants to create sweeping lawsuits so they can contain and maintain sweeping power over that whole organization and manage sort of what decisions are made and how things are run. And the reality is like those things just aren't lining up anymore. I think that's kind of the hard reality that I seem to realize whenever I look at this stuff. And that's okay. Like, if we need to have a separate space for college football to be what it is and to be able to flourish and have the economy behind it, great. Don't destroy men's and women's tennis at the collegiate level because football is in a different financial and life cycle place. We all watch TV. We all see the budgets. We all know where these things are, but we also all know that
Yeah.
we love what this is, and we love the aspect of college sports. We love the opportunities that it provides to people. And now you're in a situation where, and again, we use Texas Tech as the example because they released a lot more than other folks did for that article. Like, part of how they're going to pay for their athlete compensation portions are eliminating things like Alston Awards, which are traditionally academically driven scholarships given to kids that are student athletes. So now you're no longer being rewarded for the college aspect of what you're doing. You're being rewarded for the athletic aspect. And there's another argument to be made of like, well, they're athletes, that's what they do. But once again, as the NCAA, as a college, as these people that say 99% of athletes go pro in something other than sports, so prepare yourself. Why are you then pulling all of the incentives away from the other piece, the larger piece, time-wise, effort-wise, and lifestyle-wise of this process to give this more money as opposed to finding a new solution where maybe they aren't considered, maybe football players aren't considered amateurs for sports anymore. Maybe they fall under different rules. Maybe they have their own collective bargaining agreement, and then you still have the protection of the NCAA, well, protection of school government policies, whatever it might be, for the non-revenue generating sports while they continue to fall under the blanket of college sports in Division One. Like, that to me is so confusing why they want to like why are you trying to keep all this stuff under the same roof? Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's the G League and the WNBA and the NBA all they're trying to make them all equal, and they're not, and that's okay. Like, they have different demographics, they have different budgets, they have different life cycles, they have different everything. That's okay. Like, it doesn't mean they can't all get to the same place, but if you force everyone to go under this case, NBA law under everything else, like, you're just letting those other pieces drown. And it's like, well, if they die, they die, and that's okay. We're fine with that. And like, that should not be the mentality in college sports. Like that, in my personal opinion, that feels like we're just killing a pretty core aspect of the college or the athletics life cycle for a lot of kids and just tradition and American culture. I mean, shoot, man, can you imagine? A lot of us can't imagine going to our school and not having that be a part of it, right? Going to football games,
Hmm.
going to volleyball games, going to basketball games, going to tennis matches, everything in between. Like, it's unfortunate to kind of watch it get plucked away at essentially for the purposes of what feels like one to two sports in the grand scheme of the whole NCAA.
Yeah, I agree. I certainly agree with that because and what you're seeing, and you said it about the new president of the NCAA. I was fortunate enough to hear the old president of the NCAA, Mark Emmert, speak at a conference. It was his last conference, I believe, as president when I was with Sports Business Journal. And one of the things he spoke about was wanting Congress to come in and regulate things with the NCAA, with NIL, because it was just getting out of hand. And it is. I mean, you hear about, a Quinn Ewers getting a $8 million offer to stay in college, right? Like, that's a lot of money. That's NFL type money, right? You're talking about, an offensive lineman in the NFL looking at a $10 million a year contract. You're looking at the same thing for a college quarterback at this point. And that's the crazy part for me. And but it's unsurprising that the government would become intertwined in things with the NCAA, because the NCAA was going to lobby the government to get more of those antitrust exemptions, because it's happened in the past. The NCAA has had a number of antitrust exemptions, that have kept them out of the fire, such as this. But this was one of them that they just couldn't really get away from, because that train was just going to keep on coming, and now it's here, and you have to figure it out. So again, my hope is that an effective CBA is completed. And as I said, the approval hearing is scheduled for April 7th. They've got a couple of months to pull even more people into a room to have some sort of true CBA. Because right now, apparently, it's not good enough, right? If you have the DOJ stepping in, and the thing about it is the DOJ that did step in is no longer the DOJ that we have today. So this case can probably become fortunate of a completely different thinking DOJ being in power now. And, it is said that the DOJ that we're under right now, and again, regardless of your politics, is probably going to be more lax on things like this as opposed to the former, which is why the former stepped in when they did before, the door shut on them to at least voice their opinion. But they don't have any enforcement power over any of these things anymore, but they did step in to make these things happen. So in some sort of way, maybe they did step in to make them rethink these things to protect them so that they didn't become subject to an antitrust violation that isn't covered in the exemption of this settlement, right? So we'll certainly see. And as we've said, we've kept an eye on this for a very long time. And now it's come to this, right? Now it's come to the government stepping in and saying, hold on, pump the brakes before everything is settled. You do have to run it by the athletes. However, this original settlement and conversation didn't involve them, right? So now you're going to bring them in once you guys decided what was fair and give them essentially this offer, which is more than what they had. If somebody is in the desert and you offer them a thimble of water, they're going to take it, which is essentially the way that I see this is other people got together and figured something out for someone else. And now it's, here's your offer, take it or leave it. And the corporations involved, the NCAA and the schools, are the ones that will be protected. And if they do not approve this, they have to go back to the drawing board and get a true settlement. But that's kind of what it feels like, is that it is a take it or leave it kind of thing. And that if there is no settlement now, then it's going to get kicked down the road for an even longer time. So time will certainly tell. And I'm hopeful, like I said, of a potential salary cap, of a CBA, of more guardrails to go around these things that protect the athletes more than the corporations that have been making billions and trillions of dollars for a very, very, very long time. Reed, before we move on to part two, any other thoughts before we at least end this episode to discuss that next kind of overlap? Any parting thoughts before we move on?
I think we're back to the drawing board on the hurry up and wait, it feels like, right? We'll be paying attention to it over the coming weeks as April rolls around, and feels like my mantra on this whole thing, but I've got the highest of hopes and the lowest of expectations. So we'll just see what the next thing brings.
For sure, for sure. As I've said, we're going to move on to part two. So this is the end of the first part of this episode. We appreciate you guys listening, watching, subscribing, commenting. Continue to do that. We're going to head off to part two. So switch on over to that and we will continue our conversation there. But as always, we appreciate you guys listening to the Athletes to Athletes podcast.